After the billionaire laughed and called my advice a joke, I found myself carrying a tray instead of a briefcase. The diner smelled of burnt coffee and frying oil. Neon buzzed like a bad radio, and the vinyl on the booth bit into my thighs every time I sat. He leaned back, smoothed a silk tie, and said with a grin, "You are a charming anomaly, but what could you possibly know about capital?" I picked up his crumpled napkin with numbers scribbled on it and said, "You are bleeding from a leverage position no one bothered to stress test. I will tell you how this started, how I fell so hard, and how a single blunt question at a sticky table threw the only rope that would hold me. If you are watching, tell me where you are from in the comments." I was Rachel Mercer, a senior partner in a turnaround consultancy for 25 years, responsible for portfolios worth tens of millions. 2 years earlier, I believed I had every gate locked. I was 6 when my mother taught me to balance a checkbook on the kitchen table while the radio played financial news. I learned early that numbers have moods, that ledgers can lie, and that people will bet more on charisma than on cash flow. I studied finance because I wanted truth in columns and audits, and by 30, I had a reputation for cleaning up companies other consultants had declared hopeless. My first mentor, Ana Duarte, taught me forensic accounting tricks in a cramped office where the carpet always smelled faintly of printer toner. Paulo Serrano, my legal counsel, taught me how to read contracts as if they were human beings. Marcus Bell, an operations director I hired, could rebuild a factory schedule while I recited debt covenants. For 15 years, we rebuilt failing brands and whispered to boards that stability is not a slogan, it is a process. Then the cascade began. A private equity firm acquired a shell company we advised, and its youngest director, Victor Hale, pushed an aggressive roll-up without true due diligence. He assured shareholders in glossy slides and dinners with expensive wine that acquisition synergy would double returns. I warned the board privately. The CFO at the time, Linda Chen, nodded, but the chairman, Tom Aldridge, accepted the narrative. Headlines later would call it a miscalculation. In real time, it felt like betrayal. Rumors spread. A whistleblower leaked an email thread where my signature looked like consent, and within weeks, reputational damage turned into financial holes. Licenses were questioned. Auditors were asked to redo work once, then twice, then publicly. I was stripped of titles before I could explain the caveats I had built into the plans. My name was a line in a press release about accountability. The pile of dossiers that used to mean authority stacked up against me as proof of failure. For months, I woke with the taste of pennies in my mouth, and the sound of my own name shouted on the radio. The shame was physical. My hands trembled when I opened my bank app. My throat felt thick when I walked past office towers, and cold sweat woke me at 3 in the morning. I took a job wiping tables at a roadside diner run by a woman named Sarah who had the habit of humming old jazz as she brewed. The hours were steady, the pay minimal, but I could feel ground beneath my feet in a way I had not in a year. The fluorescent light hurt my eyes, the coffee had the metallic tang of cheap beans, and the clatter of plates became a metronome to rebuild patience. I learned to weave apologies into small talk and to laugh about tiny things so customers would not notice I was holding myself together by a single thread. I was invisible on purpose. I listened to other people's trouble over greasy fries and kept quiet about mine because silence felt safer than being targeted again. My routine became ritual. I counted change with deliberate care, folded napkins the way I used to structure spreadsheets, and cleaned the same booth where one night everything pivoted. Tension moment 1. He came in on a rainy Thursday, phone loud with a market alert, and sat in my booth like a man testing gravity. The diner hummed with the smell of vinegar and frying onions. The jukebox played a country song that scraped like a fingernail, and the light on his table made his watch shine like a warning. He pushed a crumpled napkin toward me and said, "Tell me something worth my time." I could feel my pulse in my jaw, and the grease on the table left a faint print on his cuff. I read the scribbles against the light and saw leverage ratios that owed more than the assets could carry. He smirked and said, "This is entertainment. Tell me a story." I looked up and said quietly, "It is not a story. It is a present danger." He laughed. "You are entertaining and persistent. Tell me how to fix it if you are so clever." We traded barbs like traders trading options. Each sentence I spoke smelled of coffee and iron resolve. When I said, "Close the inflows, force liquidity, renegotiate covenants instead of chasing growth," his smile died for a second. He asked, "Why should I listen to a waitress?" I answered, "Because I have seen companies die with prettier slides." He leaned forward, folded his hands, and said, "Prove it." If this moment hits you the way it hit me, I want to hear from you. If you have ever been written off in a room where someone else had money and the power to laugh, write in the comments starting with "I was there" and tell me where you were when it happened. Your short line may be one sentence or two. Your voice matters and could become a future episode where we unpack a reader's story. Tell us if you ever turned a moment of humiliation into a plan. If you have a question about restructuring, start your comment with "My question is," and I will try to answer in a follow-up. This community is about practical recovery, not platitudes. Sharing reduces isolation and gives me a pool of real experiences to analyze on screen. Now let me tell you what happened after that rainy Thursday when an offhand joke became the lever that shifted everything. The billionaire's name was Victor Hale, and his laugh was built to dismiss experts. In the weeks that followed, he kept coming back, first to the diner and then to an arranged meeting at a boutique hotel where the carpet smelled of lemon and new leather, where he brought an assistant, Sarah Park, who took notes with a polite, mechanical smile. The first formal meeting is a conversation I replay often for lessons. We sat across from each other, the light over the table making shadows like stock graphs. Victor started with a joke to set power in the room. "You were entertaining the other night, Rachel. Any chance that entertainment can translate into investment advice?" I answered, "If you want investment advice, listen to the numbers, not the noise." He smiled. "Why should I trust embarrassment over education?" I said, "Because education often defers profit to comfort, and you paid for comfort." He said, "Show me." I said, "Your portfolio is overexposed to rolling debt, and your operating cash is being leached by 6 subsidiaries with negative EBITDA." He blinked and asked, "Negative who?" I explained, "Negative earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization." He scoffed, "This is why I pay teams." I said, "Teams missed this because they wanted the acquisition narrative." He asked, "Who lost out?" I said, "Your shareholders are." He said, "And you would do what exactly?" I said, "First stop the next acquisition." He leaned forward. "Why now?" I said, "Because time multiplies errors." He asked, "What will it cost me?" I answered, "Less than the alternative." He said, "What do you want in return?" I said, "A seat at the table and full access to audit trails." He laughed, "You will be invisible to my press." I said, "I prefer visibility for results." He paused, looked at Sarah Park, and said, "Fine. Show me a plan that does not require my ego to be assaulted." I smiled. "Then let us begin with truth." Offer and acceptance came with formality and mistrust. Victor dispatched his private counsel, Paulo Serrano, called in as outside counsel for clarity, and Ana Duarte, who had once been my mentor, appeared as a reluctant intermediary because she owed me nothing, yet could not ignore a clean solution. The term sheet read like an irony. I would join as a consultant without title publicly listed. I would receive performance-based compensation indexed to cash flows and covenant compliance. And I would be granted cooperation from Linda Chen, the interim CFO, and Marcus Bell, the operations head. We spoke at length. Victor said, "I do not like being corrected." I said, "You will be corrected, but you will also be solvent." He asked for guarantees. I asked for transparency. He smiled thinly and said, "You will have both, but the press will not be told your name." I accepted. We shook hands, and both of us felt precisely how fragile promises sound. The contract that followed was a paper-thin truce that allowed me access and allowed him plausible deniability. In the back of my mind, I cataloged every scenario where access would not be enough and planned contingencies for each. Plan and execution required method and stamina. I drafted 3 processes in detail and explained them aloud to the team in a conference room that smelled of whiteboard markers and stale coffee. Process 1 was immediate: triage liquidity by consolidating cash pools across subsidiaries, freeze discretionary spend, and negotiate short-term bridge facilities with lenders to buy time. That description in 300 words became a battle nap. I walked through vendor calls, the taste of coffee during overnight calls, the hum of servers as we pulled reports, and the tactile relief of printed spreadsheets landing on a desk. Process 2 was a forensic audit of recent acquisitions to identify related party transactions and tax leakage, and to separate genuine operating goodwill from fictional synergy. I described reconciliation steps and how to pull a clean trail out of messy accounting. Process 3 was a governance reset: install interim compliance metrics, reprice executive incentives toward cash generation, not growth for growth's sake, and restructure board committees to empower the audit chair. Each step required meetings with the board, shareholders, lenders, and the chairman, Tom Aldridge. Resistance came fast. A minority shareholder asked in a public call, "Why replace optimism with austerity?" I answered, "Because optimism without liquidity is an expensive mistake." We executed in iterative waves. The first wave reduced burn within 30 days, the second produced positive cash flow in 60, and the third began renegotiating debt covenants before bank syndicates forced a fire sale. The technical parts required that I explain due diligence in plain language, walk the operations team through leverage ratios, and show lenders the math that turned a rumor of insolvency into a clear path to stability. A day of calls ended with my voice raw and my hands numb from flipping pages, but the board began to shift. Tension moment 2. The board meeting that tried to unseat the plan became a battlefield. The conference room smelled of expensive cologne and fear. The projector hummed and made everything look clinical, and the chair of the audit committee clicked his pen like a metronome of doubt. 10 shareholders packed the room, and a live stream fed pundits who smelled scandal like sharks sense blood. Tom Aldridge read a prepared note questioning the strategy and asked, "Is this going to cost us credibility?" An activist investor shouted, "We demand immediate sale." Linda Chen looked at me with wet eyes and whispered, "They will blame you." I stood and said, "You can sell assets at fire sale prices, or you can stabilize and return multiple times the value." Victor sat silent and his knuckles were white. The vote was a razor. Sarah Park called voice votes. My heart slammed into my ribs as if it could break through bone. I explained in concrete numbers the projected recovery timeline, the covenant build, and the worst-case liquidity runway. A director named Helena Cruz, previously skeptical, nodded for the first time in weeks and swayed another vote. The motion to halt the panic passed by 1 vote. The room exhaled like thunder. That exhale smelled like relief and fear braided together. Execution continued in real time with operational trenches. We renegotiated a vendor contract that saved 12% of monthly outflow. We consolidated treasury accounts, reducing idle balances and freeing working capital. And we identified a hidden lease obligation that, when restructured, improved quarterly EBITDA. I worked side by side with Marcus Bell on the factory floor, feeling the coarse metal rail under my palm and a grim satisfaction in a blue-collar rhythm that reminded me why operations matter. I presented weekly updates to shareholders, showing a slow, steady slope from alarm to stabilization. We faced a smear campaign in business press accusing me of orchestrating a cover-up when in truth I had insisted on full transparency to lenders. Victor felt the pressure. He lashed out at a public investor call, and his defensive posture created more heat than light. I learned to translate complex audit findings into simple narratives that could survive headlines and withstand scrutiny. The trick was to be relentless about facts, show the chain of custody on documents, and invite third-party auditors to testify to our processes. Tension moment 3. The turning point arrived when a forensic analyst flagged irregular wire transfers tied to an offshore entity connected to a member of Victor's inner circle. The evidence smelled of copied logs and hidden timestamps. The lab had the sterile odor of solvent and printouts that crinkled under my hands, and my stomach dropped to a cold place. I remember the analyst Maria Gonzalez tapping her pen and saying, "This is not a rounding error." She slid a folder across the table, and the hush that followed sounded like a gavel. I confronted Victor in the hallway and said, "These are not mistakes, they are tracks." He looked at me and said, "You are reaching." I said, "Then produce the ledger that proves you are not." He answered, "I do not answer to you." I said, "You answer to law and to shareholders." That exchange sharpened into formal investigation when Detective Ruiz from a financial crimes unit requested documents. The investigators asked precise questions, and the forensic trail unspooled into an account of decisions that could not be explained away as negligence. The revelation that followed put names to patterns and made accountability inevitable. Agents from a federal unit walked into a closed session with warrants and a careful presence. The boardroom smelled of polished wood and something like finality. Detective Ruiz presented a timeline of transfers, emails, and signed directives that linked questionable disbursements to a small network of executives. I watched Victor go from indignant to pale to defiant as the room filled with people whose job was to translate suspicion into legal fact. The evidence was patient and exhaustive. When the arrest was announced, it sounded both like closure and like a stern admonition that damage done to reputation can be corrected when truth is revealed. Victor maintained his innocence publicly for a day, then quietly reached a settlement that included restitution and restrictions. The media ran the story of a billionaire humbled. Headlines pivoted from scandal to prosecution, and then to how governance failures can ripple into real harm. Epilogue, 1 month later. 1 month after the crisis, the company had a new interim compliance officer named Helena Cruz, who implemented reconciliations that closed gaps in cash reporting. Ana Duarte rejoined in an advisory role to ensure the forensics remained rigorous. Paulo Serrano worked with outside counsel to draft a settlement that protected creditors while preserving operations. The offices smelled of lemon cleaner and used legal pads, and the atmosphere felt cautious and disciplined. Revenues began to stabilize, not because of magic, but because we forced truth into the light and punished sloppiness before it metastasized. I returned to a modest consulting practice and took calls with former clients who had once stopped returning my emails. The first month was about patching and trust building. Epilogue, 3 months later. At 3 months, we had concrete numbers to show stakeholders. Cash flow had moved from negative to neutral, working capital improved by 15%, and 2 formerly threatened business units showed positive operating margins. Marcus Bell reported increased throughput on the factory line, and Linda Chen finalized a renegotiated debt facility that extended maturities by 18 months. I attended a shareholder meeting where applause was not for spectacle but for survival. The list of people who had been indispensable grew. Ana Duarte, the mentor, Paulo Serrano, the lawyer, Marcus Bell, operations head, Linda Chen, interim CFO, Helena Cruz, audit chair, Detective Ruiz for the investigation, and Sarah Park, who managed communication lines. Each had specific roles that mattered,
and each had a story of risk in taking the side of truth. Epilogue 6 months later. 6 months later, the company was not the same as before the scandal, but it was healthier. We had a pipeline of new deals that required rigorous due diligence, and a market perception shifted from crisis to cautious return. Investors who had once sold low were now approaching with offers contingent on improved governance. We had repaid a portion of emergency facilities, improved margins by
20%, and established a reserve fund that acted as a shock absorber for the next cycle. My consultancy began receiving requests, and within half a year, I staffed a small team that focused on distressed assets, requiring not just financial acumen, but moral clarity. I found myself back in rooms I had once been expelled from, asked to speak on panels about restructuring, and offered a guest slot on a financial podcast to explain how forensic audits can save companies from collapse. The work was still technical because numbers do not lie, but it was also human because people make choices that create patterns, and those patterns can be corrected. Final reflections. I lost a public title and a comfortable life, and I regained something more durable, credibility earned in daylight, and a network that values truth over spin. The practical lessons are straightforward. Insist on rigorous due diligence, never let personal pride obstruct governance, align incentives to cash generation, and treat reputation as a living asset that requires honest maintenance. If you are rebuilding after a fall, name 3 allies who can vouch for your competence and call them now. Thank you to Ana Duarte Paulo, Serrano Marcus Bell, Linda Chen, Helena Cruz, Sarah Park, and Detective Ruiz for standing when it counted. If this story moved you, please subscribe to follow more cases where technical rigor and moral clarity meet in the practical work of turning companies around. Comment below with "I was there" and a one-line note about where you were when you were underestimated. Your comment might become the subject of the next episode. Remember that the clearest path to recovery is simple. Tell the truth to someone who can act on it, and then make the data support the story you want to tell.